Hello everybody, my name is Jens Folkerts and I'd like to welcome you to my pre-recorded presentation on implementing holistic L2 listening pedagogy, a DBR study which is at the same time my dissertation project. First, I would like to start with a problem statement, as is usually the case with design-based research presentations. Then I tell you a little bit more about my research design, context and databases before I continue reporting on the design process and present the embodiment. Based on that, I will also provide some findings that I could gain in my study, even though at a preliminary state. So I would like to start, due to time constraints, with just highlighting a few key findings from my analysis and exploration phase. To this end, it makes sense to outline various perspectives on tasks used in English lessons to develop listening comprehension. I would like to begin with the perspective of teachers who are often unsure as to how and through which means they can specifically develop listening comprehension. As a result, they often rely on tasks found in textbooks. From the pupil's perspective, it is worth noting that they often do not develop an understanding of how listening comprehension can be specifically learned as a skill, nor of which tasks are suitable for this purpose. Teacher trainers for English at grammar schools offer a further perspective on the phenomenon under investigation. Among other things, they criticize the lack of tasks that lead to an in-depth engagement with what is heard, meaning that higher order thinking processes often are not covered in lessons that focus on learning to listen. Finally, from a scientific perspective, it can be concluded that there is both sufficient understanding of how listening comprehension functions as a process and evidence of how and with which tasks the acquisition of listening comprehension can be supported. If we summarize the current state of foreign language teaching in my local context using an adapted version of Go and Vandegrift's framework, we can observe a predominantly product-oriented comprehension approach, which is primarily concerned with determining whether the learner's listening comprehension process has been successful in relation to defined objectives. Even though this approach is well suited to summative assessment, it lacks a concrete focus on the listening comprehension process and is thus less suitable for learning situations we actually aim to create within the classroom. This raises the question of how we can establish a more holistic approach, which is why the following overarching question can be derived from my project. What are design principles for creating competence-oriented classroom settings that foster the L2 listening competence more holistically? Today, I would like to focus primarily on different types of tasks. To help you better understand what follows, I would like to briefly touch on the concept of design principles because they are at the heart of my study. So what are they? In general, it can be said that design principles should be understood as key mediators between theory and practice. Prediger further defines design principles as prescriptive theoretical elements. As you will see, design principles are prescriptive in that they are formulating using a logic which, to put it simply, often takes the form to achieve X, Y should be done in such and such a way. Design principles do not simply arise from gut instinct, but they are based on theoretical foundations, empirical findings that are in the field, and also reflection on the design process itself. So it is particularly evident from this that design principles always require concretization within a specific context and are subject to continuous development. I would like to illustrate how design principles are formed by reflecting on the design process in my project and telling you about how theory is developed in design-based research. So, as a conceptual framework for theory development, I use Sandoval's conjecture mapping. The starting point is an assumption about how learning can be promoted. We could also call this assumption a preliminary design principle, and at the start of a DBR project it is usually informed by theoretical insights and existing empirical evidence. These assumptions are then translated into a so-called embodiment, that is, the concrete design of lessons. The learners then engage with this design, which, ideally, leads to the desired outcomes. Both the design itself and the learner's engagement with it, as well as the desired outcomes, are to some extent observable and can be assessed using empirical instruments. In this way, empirical evidence can be generated, which, through reflection and the enrichment of additional theoretical insights, leads then to the further development of the design principle and can thus inform a subsequent design process more precisely. But what does that actually look like, and what is the context in which I conducted my research? So the first 2 years of my PhD research were used to identify the problem and determine how to tackle it. I then used the insights gained during this time to plan a series of lessons in collaboration with a teacher, which she intended to deliver at her school. The series of lessons, also known as the initial prototype, was subsequently delivered by various teachers at 2 schools for various reasons, and I provided empirical support throughout this phase. The insights gained during this phase and the deeper understanding we developed then led to a redesign of the teaching module with a new co-designer. As things stand, I'm still in the process of analyzing the rather complex data set, and as you can see, the development of a further final, in quotation marks, prototype is planned for this year. I have already touched upon the complexity of the data and will not go into detail there. What you may, however, be able to see is the expansion of data collection between the first and second design cycle, as it was important to me to capture the learner's perspectives even more comprehensively. That's why I attended the lessons in the second design cycle, which I was not able to do in the first design cycle, and by that also gained a much deeper understanding of what is going on in the classroom. Before I started with my co-designer to develop the specific teaching module of the second design cycle, I outlined my plans to him and explained what I thought would be most effective based on my knowledge at the time. I would like to briefly explain this to you, focusing on the objectives of the teaching module. One insight from the first design iteration was that listening comprehension is placed at the center of the curriculum through a complex sequence-based task that focuses on genuinely spoken target text genres. In addition, 3 different types of tasks, which we will focus on in a minute, should be included. And third, it became clear during the first design cycle that the teachers should implement tasks in a way that fosters the students' agency. Having a closer look at the aforementioned types of tasks to include, we can see that the first category of tasks comprises those designed to promote the automation of language processing. In so-called micro-listening tasks, the focus is on phenomena of spoken natural language, such as identifying stressed words, and so on. There is evidence in research literature that these types of tasks have a positive effect on learners' listening comprehension skills. At the same time, they also serve as a diagnostic tool for teachers, as they can provide highly targeted learning promoting feedback based on such tasks. And last but not least, this approach allows for the creation of specific practice tasks for learners. As I wanted to inform my co-designer with some more details on how this specific form of tasks should be included, I formulated a design conjecture, which he then used to create the tasks we used in the teaching sequence. Some noteworthy aspects are that students should work with transcripts and that the learner interaction should move from individual working phases to more collaborative forms of interaction. A second type that of tasks that were supposed to be incorporated in the teaching sequence focuses on deeper individual processing. In other words, on the question of how learners actually link the information they have extracted with their existing knowledge. Such tasks meet the requirement set by teacher trainers to consistently incorporate higher order cognitive skills. At the same time, teachers in my local context are familiar with such task formats from their work with other text types such as written texts, and can create these types of tasks more easily and quickly than, for example, product-oriented test formats. Furthermore, these tasks tend to be perceived as more meaningful by the students due to the engagement with the content of what has been heard. However, there is not yet empirical evidence regarding possible positive effects. Finally, a third typology of tasks focuses on allowing listeners to exert a certain degree of control by applying metacognitive strategies. There is already ample evidence of the effectiveness of tasks that relate to this area of competence development. At the same time, the reflective nature of the tasks also addresses higher order cognitive demands, and learners can enhance their perception of self-efficacy. Similarly to the first category of tasks that focuses on automatic language decoding, I also formulated more explicit design conjectures for my co-designer that provided him with more details how to design these tasks. Next, I would like to explain how we put this into action. As stated in the first design principle, we made clear to the learners at the start of the teaching module that they would be working continuously on producing their own podcast, and particularly the long-term learning objectives were clearly communicated. Furthermore, it was also established early on that the learners would engage intensively and in-depth with longer audio texts, become aware of the listening comprehension strategies, and familiarize themselves with different podcast genres. We decided to break away from a linear approach to the tasks and adopt a project-based approach, allowing learners to decide for themselves how to work with the texts. To this end, we developed 3 different modules to accompany the project phase, covering the types of tasks mentioned earlier. Module 1 focuses on engaging with the content of what is said. In addition to Module 1, learners were required to select a further task from Module 2 or 3 each time they listened to the text. Module 2 focused on promoting metacognitive strategies, whilst Module 3 aimed to automate language processing. The project phase was also accompanied by a group-specific topic, enabling the learners to explore a subject that best matched their interests. And to keep track of who was working on what and which tasks during the project phase, we drew up a summary in a Kanban board manner, which the learners also found very useful to keep track of what they were doing. I would now like to go into a little more detail about the tasks designed to automate language and data processing. We have incorporated these into Module 3, but also into a short micro-listening exercise that we carried out at the beginning of several lessons. The difficulty for us was to strengthen the learner's agency. We had decoupled the tasks from the listening texts. This is particularly challenging with this type of tasks, as we often work with transcripts or modified transcripts to focus on specific phenomena of natural spoken language. One way in which we have addressed the decoupling of audio, text and task was developed based on the idea of the dictogloss method, by giving learners the task of producing a transcript themselves for a short sequence. In addition, we have included tasks aimed at identifying stressed words and automated process that is particularly relevant in the context of isolated assessment. Other tasks the students could choose focus on either the perception of very fast passages or the text of text or the interplay between multiple speakers. And as you can see, the tasks here only partially meet the preliminary design principle, as in particularly the discussion of the solutions no longer took place within the framework of the tasks. This was a decision that was not an easy one for us to make, but it was taken in the interest of the learner's agency. as the designed discussion phases would have been impossible to coordinate. To address this shortcoming, we introduced a micro-listening activity, which we carried out a total of 5 times. And at the start of each lesson, the learners were presented with a short audio clip and a transcript. The overall task was to mark the words emphasized by the speaker, and none of these activities lasted longer than 5 minutes. Here are a few examples of learners' answers. And as you are maybe able to see, the learners' solutions vary greatly, reflecting their differing abilities to identify stress in the foreign language. It can be observed that existing stresses on function words such as the or are not marked, presumably due to a strong focus on the transcript and or a lack of significance for the text, or alternatively, that virtually everything in the text is marked, which suggests that the differentiated perception of stress patterns in the foreign language is not sufficiently developed. I believe this example illustrates the diagnostic potential of this task typology very well, as very targeted feedback could be provided afterwards. Unfortunately, this was not possible within the constraints of our setting. Combining this observation with other results, some preliminary findings can be drawn that influence the adaptation of my design principles. Especially in the conducted interviews, but also, as you could see in the teaching artifacts, the diagnostic potential of the used micro-listening activities became apparent to the stakeholders involved. Whereas results from the teacher's perspective, this diagnostic potential needs to be used even further. Learners reported that the micro-listening ritual helped them accept and understand the use of the task presented in Module 3. Hence, based on these and other results, the design principle needed to be adapted. 3 main changes highlighted in the green sections were made to the design conjecture presented before. First, the diagnostic potential should be used to provide students even further with individualized practice. Second, to heighten the learners' group's language awareness, specific phenomena of natural spoken language should be focused on as part of micro-listening rituals at the start of lessons. And third, further individualized practice should be connected to the ongoing complex competence task. Besides this very short illustration of just one minor finding of my study that aims at understanding the complexities of establishing a holistic L2 listening pedagogy, I would like to highlight some further insights very briefly. Even though it should be obvious to everybody who ever stood in front of a class already, it could be observed that all authenticity of tasks and materials were key factors for the learner's motivation. Especially the focus on the content of the listening text was perceived as rather new by the students and had meaningful character that helped the students to gain a better understanding of different podcast genres. Even though metacognitive strategy training is generally effective, not all of our learners profited from it, and the results indicate that this is due to a lack of experience with metacognition in general, an aspect that is highly relevant with regard to curriculum development in my local context. We need to include this aspect way earlier. Finally, focusing on teaching oracy in a holistic way in the teaching sequence not only improved the learner's spoken output, but also their perception of English as a meaningful subject, which is, given the age group of 14-year-olds, one of the best compliments we could hope for. And with this positive note, I would like to thank you very much for lending an ear.